A rare intro author's note. I am writing this on the off chance someone returns to reread the chapter and gets the feeling something is missing. This chapter has been edited. It previously contained some controversial content pertaining to real-life events. By itself, this would not be a problem to me, the content being controversial and/or pertaining to real-life events, that is. But after some closer looks at the rules and guidelines and more thought, I have decided to remove this content. I do not agree with censorship. However, I do not feel that this is censorship, as I am removing this of my own free will, as I was already somewhat hesitant with posting it as it was. As even though there are sections I have planned that are to be quite dark, I am still largely writing this as entertainment, not to remind people of bad times they may have experienced in our real-life history. Nothing in the rules or guidelines outright said I could not use that kind of content itself, but I feel that as the content was not advancing any major plot points, as the rules and guidelines encourage, that its inclusion, while technically okay, was not needed and would cause unneeded problems, and so it has been removed. I'll see you in the outro. AN. My name is Anthony Cooper, currently a Major General commanding the 2nd Armored Division, 6th Army, 10th Army Group. Back when the war first broke out, however, I was just a captain commanding Bravo Troop, 5th Squadron, 10th Regiment, 2nd Armored Division, 9th Army. I had been in the Army for about 7 years when the HFY took over HFY. When it happened, the whole military went to Threat Condition 1, meaning all bases were restricted to military personnel only, and all security personnel like the MPs were to be on their highest alert. If you farted weird, they were to question you. That's the kind of alert I'm talking about. Most armies, including the 9th, also went to Combat Condition 3. Half the unit was preparing equipment, and the other half resting while waiting to take over for the other half, and the entire unit had to be ready to move within a day. We knew, though, that it'd be a bit before anything major happened. Had to give time for diplomatic solutions. Still, best to be ready to go when we needed to. Something I've not seen talked about much is what happened to all our military bases in the HFY cluster when the HFY came knocking. Well, if we knew how things would have gone, we might have put up a fight, try and stop them right there. As it was, the forward-most bases tried to evacuate as many as they could. Being mostly anti-piracy and law enforcement units, they didn't have much in the way of heavy equipment. Only about 1 in 5 were meant to be proper military bases, with actual warships and heavy equipment, like armor. Even then, it wasn't much, mainly stuff to defend themselves until reinforcements got there. Good old war contingency yellow. Those bases that were too vulnerable would be evacuated to those that weren't, and everyone would essentially hold the line until the main forces from the Corps could come to the rescue. Of course, with the speed and size of the HFY advance, it was clear that wouldn't work, so, instead, War Contingency Black was prepared for. Pull back to the Corps, and by that time, it would be determined how things would go. Several of the forward-most bases just couldn't get out of the way in time. We don't have too much to go off of, but we do know at least a few of them had fought back since their units never reported in. The most well-known one of these was a fight over one of them that was practically right on the border, in the system we called Frontier. It wasn't the first hit, but it didn't take long before they knew what was going on. They didn't know which war contingency was to be implemented, but it wasn't of much concern once a HFY cruiser entered into the system. There were 2 civilian outposts in the system, not too big, but big enough it'd take a day to get out. They'd only just begun evacuating when the cruiser showed. This base, Outpost 2222, was only one of the minor ones. About a dozen patrol boats was all they had available. Certainly not enough to do any real damage to a cruiser. Still, the commander of Outpost 3222, Colonel Hargrove MacDonald, sent his boats out and managed to delay the cruiser until the last of the civilians had managed to escape. Then, with only 3 boats left, ordered the remaining 2 out while he delayed the enemy. Took his boat on a suicide run right into the cruiser. Didn't outright destroy it, but the collision was enough to get the cruiser written off as a total loss. Somewhat fitting that the first medal of the Emperor's recognition, the highest award a UAE service member can receive, of the war was awarded to Colonel MacDonald, someone who barely even got to see the war start. On the whole though, most of the forward outposts either got out or were captured. Further back from the border, proper organized evacuations were possible. It was a hell of an undertaking, especially without the material benefits we'd have once everything got geared up. Moving billions of people and tens of billions of tons of equipment within a few weeks over hundreds of light years was tough, but we did it. However, we did know that billions more were now held captive by the HFY. We got ready to get them back. If only we'd been faster. We waited those anxious first weeks to see how things would play out. We'd gone to combat condition 3 a few times in response to possible wars, but always ended up standing down after about a week and a half. This time, when the 3rd week passed without a stand-down order, we really started putting serious effort into our preparations. Then came morning day. Obviously we watched the speech live. A minute or 2 after it was over, the command sergeant major for the 5th peeked his head into the doorway of our motor pool. His words were simple and unemotional yet conveyed all that needed to be said. "Captain Cooper, get your troop together and mount up. Time to get to work." We did as we were told. As the guys on hand jumped up to get the vehicles ready, I got on the comm and roused those who weren't already present, which wasn't much. Everyone else in the 5th did the same, and we were ready to go within an hour. We got everyone in line to take transports from the 2nd Armored Staging Base in Rome to the 9th Army's staging point at Cairo. Due to the 2nd Armored's history, whatever army we were a part of would stage there so that when the entire army got moved to the transports waiting in space, the division would be seen off by the Emperor in his tomb. The 1st Infantry Division, the oldest division in the UAE, also got that honor. While they were the oldest division overall, the 2nd Armored was the oldest armored division, though the 1st has the 2nd beat by a few decades, and they've never let us forget it. It took a few hours, but the 9th Army was soon assembled in Cairo. The men loaded up onto shuttles while our vehicles were transported separately. As we lifted off, I took a moment to look out the window. The tomb stood there, imposing and silent, but I could almost feel a sense that the Emperor was watching us. The time he hoped would never come had done so. The time when his children were forced to take up arms again. It felt like he was wishing us luck. It made me feel good. When we reached the freighter that would be transporting us, the CSM gathered all the squadron's ranking officers together, and we held a meeting with Donald McBrindle, our Lelt Col. We were informed of all the happenings thus far, and that we were currently on our way to meet up with the 13th Fleet, to then move on to wherever higher command decided we needed to go. We were also told the 9th Army would join the 45th, 91st and 57th Armies to form the 10th Army Group. Aside from that, he gave us an attempt at an inspirational speech but failed horribly, which he acknowledged with "I hate speeches because I suck at them." That got a chuckle from us. Then it was just waiting. Lots of rechecking equipment. I'm proud to say that my troops' vehicles were in parade condition, wouldn't last for long but showed how serious we took our jobs. After a couple days we joined the 13th over Huttle Station, the largest of the outposts in the Alpha Centauri system. We stayed there for about a week before we finally got orders. The 10th AG would retake the Armani system, 2 semi-habitable planets, and a dozen asteroid outposts. With the size of the pre-war army being what it was a bit surprising we'd be going after a system so far from the core with just a single army group, but far be it from us to question orders. The idea was apparently to set up a central point that we could get to with little difficulty, supply it, and then launch multiple attacks in all directions. Once we arrived in system, a few meetings took place where the plan was explained. The 45th and 9th armies would be taking care of the smaller of the two habitable planets, while the other half of the 10th AG would be taking on the larger one. It was expected that the 45th and 9th would finish up quickly and go on to help the 91st and 57th if they needed, and if they didn't, we'd go on to start taking the asteroids. Now I don't want to toot any horns, but I like to think that our invasion, which was to be the beginning of the retaking of the Hyades, is the cause of the HFY's decision to implement their burn and run strategy and their use of the alter jammers, because our attack on Atara, that smaller planet, was just about as perfect as you could have gotten. When we got into orbit, we found that large tracts of the planet were plains. When we in the 2nd Armored heard that, we started to get that feeling. The plan was simple. The 9th would land in the northern plains, and the 45th would go to the southern plains, both locations being out of range of any SSM or SM sites on the planet. An infantry division would be the first to land, and would secure an LZ to bring in the rest of the army. From there the armored divisions of the 9th and 45th would take the lead, and do what we do best, steamroll. The only two cities on the planet were in the southeast and east side of the plains, and recon showed that's where most of the 1.5 million garrison was, and where their defenses were. We'd charge in from the north of our city, and the 45th would do the same to the south of theirs. From there the infantry and artillery divisions would largely take over for us in clearing the cities. Normally you'd want a 4-to-1 advantage in numbers when assaulting a prepared position, but it was believed that not enough time had passed between the invasion and now for the HFY to have entrenched themselves that deeply. Plus it was their first time fighting us, and we hoped that our tactics would be enough of a surprise to carry us through these first fights. We had a pre-war army of 800 million, but a lot of them were spread out throughout the rest of the empire to protect against any other possible attacks, even though we highly doubted there would be. We also had chosen to go straight through the HFY defenses, even where they were strongest, and it was probably a better idea to try and flank them, for the sheer intimidation value of them being assaulted by tanks storming right at them, something our intelligence said they hadn't really experienced, at least for a long time. I won't lie, we were getting excited. Our M6 MBTs and M8 IFVs were capable of over 55 miles an hour on proper ground. We had trained for this, and were starting to get itching to put our training into practice. We got the signal to go and our vehicles loaded onto the dropships. When we landed, I was impressed by the staging base the infantry had managed to get up within a couple days. Barracks, fuel depots, power stations. It was like a mini version of one of our bases back on Earth. It took another day or two to get the rest of the division down from orbit. From there some more recon occurred, and we confirmed our plan was sound. Once everything was ready, we moved out. It was as amazing of a sight as always. Hundreds of tanks and IFVs powering over green fields at 40 miles an hour. We'd all seen the sight before during major exercises, but you never quite got over the feeling of power such a maneuver emitted. The 2nd Armored came from the northern plains, so we went for the eastern city. Being about 500 miles away, we only needed to stop once, at roughly 50 miles from the enemy, to refuel our vehicles. I've always wondered if we'll ever get those proposed nuclear-powered tanks because issues with consumables like food and ammo aside, biogas is the biggest limit on how far we can go. After refueling, we set up an FOB to give a place for supplies brought in from the staging area to reduce the length of our supply line. It was getting dark, so most of us slept in our tanks, if we slept at all. As you can imagine, it was quite hard to get sleep knowing that tomorrow was the big day. My crew didn't. We were up for most of the night talking about the attack coming in the morning. The entire division's orders were simple. Attack, 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 shoot left, right and center, but don't let off the gas. If the tank in front of you gets hit, go around or push it out of the way. Whatever you do, do not stop. 3 infantry divisions. I should mention now that all of the UEE's infantry divisions were mechanized so they could keep up with the tanks, would follow us with one on either side of and one behind to protect the flanks and rear, and the artillery division, which was also mechanized, would follow behind them to support us if and when we needed it. The last infantry division would be left behind to guard both the landing zone and our FOB just in case recon was wrong, and there were HFY units outside of the cities. The 45th Army would mirror us to the south. The HFY had little to no air support, and a peculiar quirk of theirs for the first few years of the war was they had no artillery. They had mass accelerator anti-tank weapons and these strange mortar-like things for direct fire use against infantry and bunkers and the like, but no big guns for firing high explosives rounds indirectly. They didn't even have tanks. We guessed they'd come to rely on air support so much that they no longer saw a need for big guns and figured we'd roll over, and so didn't supply many aircraft to lesser planets. I know they would soon wish they had some. The defenses consisted of machine gun and anti-tank positions, trenches, and other groundworks. We didn't expect much trouble. If they realized who they were coming up against, they might have tried to adopt a more maneuver-based defense instead of trying to be a wall our speeding car would stop cold against. We did finally get some sleep, but only an hour or two. Thankfully, the army had found solutions for such situations. When we woke up, we popped a dose of the special non-addictive pills we were issued for short-term use in order to kickstart the day if we didn't get proper sleep the night before. We jokingly called them vitamins, not sure what was in them, but they did their job well. After about 15-20 minutes, you'd feel like you'd had a good night's sleep. Awareness is sharp, your mind and body doesn't feel off. It's literally just an acceleration of your normal process of waking up. As I said, they were non-addictive, but that fact itself made them prone to abuse. If you know the pick-me-up doesn't hurt you, you have less of a tendency to moderate your use of it. We would find out eventually that our vitamins weren't completely harmless. For the moment though, they were just what we needed. We just got awake when the order came over the radio to start engines. I poked my head out of the turret and looked around. I saw the squadron's attached mechanized infantry troops slinging on their packs and climbing into the back of their M8s, their big bulky green shapes blending well with the terrain, and the sleeker, more angular shapes of the M6s. In the distance, I could make out other commanders in the other squadrons also poking their heads up as the light-colored puffs of exhaust blew out of their exhausts. I gave the order for ours to start, and that lovely whine quickly built up behind me from our multi-fuel engine, and was joined by 13 others. The more guttural grunt of our troops' supply truck made itself known briefly over the M6s. Then the LT Cole came over the net and reiterated the no-stopping order before ordering us into combat spread. I relayed it to my troop, and we moved with the squadron out of the FOB's outer barrier into the open field, arraying ourselves with both tank troops forward and the infantry troop behind us. The other two squadrons of the regiment did the same to either side of us. After a little while, I could see in the distance as the other two tank regiments laid themselves out on either side of ours. It was a magnificent display of coordination and power. The division's artillery, protection and sustainment regiments of all the divisions fell in with the artillery division and would follow us at quite a distance for their own protection. This is it, gentlemen. Keep your heads down and feet on the gas. We'll show the HFY who they've screwed with. Now then, 2nd Armored, roll out. That was all the incentive we needed. Connor, advance. I shouted to my driver, and he hit the accelerator. The 75-ton beast jerked forward and picked up speed. All around us, our fellow tankers did the same. The roar of hundreds of engines coming to full power was deafening, even over our headsets. We quickly kicked up a dust trail behind us. We must have looked like quite the sight on the horizon. It took about an hour, but we soon could see the Hardzai's defenses outside of the city, which we could just make out in the background. Without missing a beat, the LT Cole called in the opening airstrike. I popped back out of the turret, just in time to see the near-literal storm of A-100s coming in. Thanks to jamming, the Hardzai's handful of mobile SAM launchers barely even had a chance to aim before they were destroyed via a flurry of air-to-ground missiles. Even more AGMs took out bunkers, and a storm of rockets streaked to the ground and hit their mark, assuredly blowing apart anyone outside of the trenches. Bombs were not used in an attempt to preserve as much of the narrow trenches as possible, to make it easier for our tanks to cross. We came to a small hill that temporarily obscured all sight of the defense. As we came over the top, we got a good view of the destruction. The mangled mess of bunkers, the craters between the trench lines from the rockets. We could see the small dots of Hardzai infantry scurrying through the trenches, trying to find a haven from the aerial barrage. Our self-propelled artillery and the various support units would hold on the hill till we were through. Without stopping, we charged down this hill. The bumps in the terrain shook us around, but our suspension handled it well, and our gun stabilizers kept their barrels pointed right where we wanted them. I gave James, our gunner, the instruction to take aim at whatever he thought needed a dose of HE. When we got within 2 miles, we got the order to fire at will. The sound of hundreds of 130 mm guns firing almost simultaneously is something I'll never forget. The defenses in front of us just disappeared in a poof of dust and smoke. Then they went off again, then again, again and again and again. The entire division fired our main guns, shredding what was left of their defense lines. Going 50 miles an hour, we quickly reached the line, and aiming our tanks for the intact portions of the trenches, which were narrow enough we could cross them without getting stuck, we plowed over them. I got on the M2A7, 50 cal attached to the rotatable ring of my hatch, and did my best to get any infantry that remained in the open. It didn't take long before we were through the first line. Once we were, the LT Cole reminded us to stay on our toes as the next line of defense was only 15 minutes ahead. He then called on air support again, though before he even finished the transmission, more A-100 streaked in and unleashed hell. Once more, we opened fire at 2 miles, and once more, we stormed up and over the Hardzai defenses. The speed of our advance was just too fast for them. These men in the second line had barely even begun to understand what was going on when our tanks cleared their trenches with machine gun fire and blew their dugouts apart with 130 mm shells. We did start to encounter their anti-tank guns more and made sure to target them first if they weren't already taken out by the A-100s. It had only been about an hour since we charged down that hill, but we were already coming up on the third and last line of defense. Once we broke through, we'd be only 20 miles from the city outskirts. The third line had barely more time to prepare than the second, but they did seem to use it as best they could, and being the last line, had the heaviest emplacements. When we went to open fire, after the quick flyover by the A-100s, we got return fire from some very well concealed anti-tank guns that survived the air attack. The tank beside ours took a hit to the turret, which somehow managed to ricochet off. One shot went past me, and I will not lie to save face, I did in fact piss myself slightly. Once you've heard the crack of a hypervelocity round snap past you just feet away, you'll know what fear feels like. Thankfully, James had seen the small puff of dust that got kicked up when the gun fired, and managed to put a shell into its bunker, and silenced it. It was about this time when I actually took the chance to look around. I don't even really have the words to describe the scene. Huge armored beasts racing along over trenches, spewing machine gun fire in every direction. I managed to catch a glimpse of a Hardzai that attempted to clamber out of his trench just in time to get crushed under the treads of an M8. I turned to the other side and just managed to get the 50 around and fire a burst at another hardseye that had leaned out from around a boulder to try and somehow sling some kind of grenade in front of us. I believe only one of my rounds hit him, but it hit him center mass. He just exploded into a mist of blood and meaty chunks, and right after, his grenade went off and blew the boulder apart. Then, just before we cleared the defenses, we took the first loss. One last AT gun that managed to go undetected got a bead on his target and fired. The sixth tank to our right just detonated as the round cut through its armor and ignited its biogas fuel tank. Our vehicles were designed to try and compartmentalize ammo or fuel explosions, but sometimes things just don't go your way. His squadron mates didn't take kindly to their friends' deaths, however, and at least 7 of them all fired at this gun, and it simply disappeared in the combined explosions of 7 130mm rounds. In keeping with our orders, we didn't slow down, and with the last of the third line behind us, we were now in the open ground, between it and the city. Men from the following infantry division would stop to clear out the stragglers of each line to secure our rear before catching up. We moved on to the city to keep the momentum going, but even at 50 miles an hour, the 20 miles would take us nearly half an hour to reach it. Recon showed that, compared to the defense lines, the city didn't have much in the way of defenses, but even just a couple divisions of infantry could hold an entire army group for weeks if they used the buildings and narrow alleyways right. And these guys would have time to prepare much more than the defense lines did. We came to the top of a small hill that overlooked the city. What we saw astonished us. The hardseye had knocked down some of the skyscrapers to block streets and create prepared killing zones, but the hardseye infantry themselves were casually strolling around, like nothing was amiss. The vehicles they did have were still lined up neatly in a motor pool. We knew we'd moved fast, but not that fast. It was almost like looking into the recent past. It was eerie. The division stopped for a moment while we figured out what we wanted to do. It was during this break that we noticed that the hardseye seemed to be finally reacting to our breakthrough. Thanks to the speed of our advance, we still had plenty of daylight to work with, so it was quickly decided to continue the attack with the armor to keep the momentum going. The infantry would follow and slowly break down into company-sized units to start clearing the buildings as the armor passed by. Judging by the downed buildings, it seemed that the hardseye had decided to turn the city into a defense-in-depth situation, closing off streets and alleyways in such a way that we'd have to follow a certain path. They hadn't seemed to have accounted for air support though. As we made our way through, we called for heavy bombing of the blockages. A 100-sack dropped precision-guided 2,000-pound bombs with delay fuses into the mass piles of debris, blowing them apart, while leaving any other buildings near them intact. And this is how we cleared the city. Precision bombs to clear roadblocks, tank fire to clear strongpoints, and infantry to rout anyone left out of their hidey holes. It took us the rest of the month, but the city did eventually fall. All in all, it was figured that we had killed about 265,000 hardseye between the prepared defense lines and the city fighting. On top of that, when the remaining garrison of the city finally surrendered, our tally of enemy captured reached 535,000. The 45th had similar success, though we did have to send one of our infantry divisions over for extra manpower clearing their city, which was more resistant. Still, it was only an extra week, and the hardseye facing them surrendered as well, adding another 275,000 dead and 425,000 prisoners to the tally, for a total of 540,000 dead and 960,000 captured, all in just a month. As for us, we lost about 100,000 men, about 40 tanks, and around 110 other armored vehicles, with 95% of that from the city fighting. Regardless of that, it was a stunning victory however you looked at it. Now an interesting tidbit is we found out that during that lull while we overlooked the city and decided how to proceed, some HFY transmissions had been intercepted, where their commanders were attempting to sort out what was going on. Between our assault and the 45th Sex, there was mass confusion. Somewhere in all of it, somehow, they had managed to identify our division via markings on the tanks. Their problem was the armored division attached to the 45th Army also had very similar markings. So to the HFY commanders, it was as if the 2nd Armored had been in multiple places at once, and at times, that should have been impossible. It was in this mess where one of the HFY commanders said something that's gone down in 2nd Armored history, and from which we got our famous nickname. His actual statement/question was this 2nd Armored Division isn't some supernatural phantom division, it can't be in 2 places at once. Are we sure it's 1 division and not 2? One of the guys got on the intercom and said about how phantom divisions sounded cool. Another countered him and said it wasn't catchy. The first guy replied back, what about ghost division then? After all, phantoms are ghosts. Thus from this campaign onward, the 2nd Armored Division earned the nickname/title of the Ghost Division, and our motto became 1 division 2 places. We did some research and found that a similar attack had been carried out centuries ago. During the second of our 3 world wars, where an armored division broke through enemy defenses far faster than expected, and caused enough chaos and confusion to be called a ghost division. Difference was that the attack had taken place over a longer time period, and didn't involve being confused with another armored division. Despite that division having been a part of an army, led by some very evil people, we decided we'd still take pride in the name. After all, we had earned it. After securing Atara, we found that the 91st and 57th had cleared their planet a few weeks before we'd secured ours. So it was then decided that they would clear the asteroids, while the 9th and 45th moved on. We took a few more systems, but the HFY had started to get a grip on the situation, and changed their tactics, implementing burn and run as well as the jammers. It'd take us about a year and a half, but like the rest of the UEE military, we soon found ourselves on the border between human and HFY space. It was during one of clearing campaigns out there that the war would start to deteriorate from a clean fight to the horrific slaughterfest it has come to be remembered as, "Oh sweet Jesus, I did it again. Broke another promise. I swear on my mother's life, I do not plan to string people along like this." I fully intended to post more chapters in the last 3 months. It was just that around when I was finishing this chapter up that I really put effort into trying to find a new job, and ended up returning to my old one. I really just kind of psyched myself out, and should have just taken an unpaid week off to get my mind right. Thus the last 6 weeks have been a stress-filled fog of trying to get back into the swing of things. Anyway, all I can do is apologize again for the big delay. We are getting ready to get stuck into the gritty part of the war though, so that should be interesting. I've only got maybe one more main character to introduce, and I'm not even really sure if I will, as I've already got 4 MCs: Genta, Honcho, Reed and now Cooper, who've all seen plenty to fill out the rest of the story. I am not George Martin. I can't properly keep track of too many characters while still giving them proper time. Speaking of him, he once said that there are 2 types of writers, gardeners and architects. I am quite clearly of the former variety. I have the general idea and a few certain scenes, and just let things grow from there. Which is funny because I generally like structure. It helps keep my autistic brain, not a joke, bolts focused. I reference him frequently, as I admire his writing ability, and try to adhere to some of the advice he has given out on writing. I also apologize if the ending seems abrupt. I kinda ran out of stuff for this section,
and I wanted to finally get this out and do so before I go to sleep. It's 0125 EST right now, so I ended it as best I could. I know the last line seems like a cliffhanger, but please don't take it as such. It was just the best way I could think to say we'd see more from this character without saying that. I guess that's all I have to say, really. I hope you enjoy this chapter. Do let me know if you notice a drop-off in the quality of the writing. I know where I stopped writing this chapter, and considering the main reason I finished it up today is because I've kept you all waiting so long as it is, and not because I really felt like writing. I'm curious to see if anyone notices a quality drop-off at that point. Can't tell you when though, since that'd turn your brain on to trying to find that point. I'll quit blathering and get some sleep. Hope to see you again real soon.